Hey friends, this episode is brought to you by the folks over at Ridge. But this time, it's not their awesome wallets or their handy key holders. Instead, today's sponsor is Ridge Rings. Now you might be asking yourself, why did a company that makes a wallet branch out into jewelry of all things? Well, as the folks at Ridge put it, their goal is to design gear that's minimalist, functional, and reliable, turning everyday items into tools that make you more comfortable and more productive. Whether you're working out or working hard, the Ridge beveled ring set gives you a solution for every occasion. Their products are made of high-quality premium materials, including carbon fiber, tungsten carbide, 24-karat gold, and titanium. They also feature what's known as an outer beveled edge, meaning increased on-hand comfort, as well as an inner convex shape for a comfortable, no-pinch fit, and a dual-band silicone ring for when you want to be comfortable or casual. But I think one of my favorite features of the Ridge ring is its lost and resizing protection. Each purchase of a Ridge beveled ring set entitles you to 2 future ring replacements, meaning if you lose or outgrow one, Ridge will replace it completely free of charge. Given how easy it is to misplace some rings, Ridge wants to give you that double peace of mind. And even better, you can get up to 40% off your purchase until December 22nd. All you have to do is head over to ridge.com/letsread and pick up an awesome holiday gift this year for almost half the price. The Christmas after my son turned 4 years old was the first he seemed to actually understand. He knew what Christmas was, as in he was familiar with all the other symbolism behind it, but it wasn't until 4 that he really started to get it. I remember the day that he came home from preschool to ask me if some guy called Santa was really going to climb down our chimney to bring him presents. He didn't realize that we didn't have a chimney, so to keep up the pretense, I told him Santa had a magic key that let him climb through the windows of houses that didn't have chimneys. It was all the best I could come up with on the spot, but my son bought it, and seeing all this awe and wonder and excitement on his face made me happy in ways I didn't think possible. I didn't exactly have the best upbringing myself. Things like Christmases weren't exactly a priority, so it was really important to me that my son got to experience that magical spirit of Christmas. The closer it got to the day itself, the more and more excited my son got. He'd non-stop ask me questions about Santa, beg me to take him to meet him at the mall. He was just so caught up in the spirit of the season, it made me and his mom very happy indeed. We joked about how we dreaded the day that we'd have to tell him that Santa wasn't real, and how we should let that childhood innocence endure for as long as possible. Little did we know, he'd lose that innocence way sooner than we figured, and in a way that was pretty terrifying, even for me. It was the night of Thursday, December 22nd, 2016. I remember that because the Thursday was our last day of work before the long holiday weekend, and we all busted our butts trying to get a dozen different orders shipped in time. Needless to say, I was exhausted by the time I got home, and both me and my wife headed to bed early so we could get a head start on all the holiday-related chores in the morning. I pretty much passed out as soon as my head hit the pillow, but then the next thing I know, I'm opening up my eyes to the sight of my son standing over me. The room's still dark, and he's asking me about Santa again. I had to roll over and ask him to repeat the question, hiding my irritation that he felt the need to come wake me up in the middle of the night, and that's when I heard him ask, "Does Santa ever come early sometimes?" I told him no, that he only ever visited on the night of Christmas Eve, but then my son tells me that he thought that Santa was visiting our neighbors because he could see someone on the roof. Immediately, that sets alarm bells off for me, so I climb out of bed, throw on a robe to keep the nighttime chill at bay, and then head into my son's bedroom to see what he was talking about. The moment I walked into his room, I see exactly what he was talking about. His bedroom window looked out over our backyard, which in turn led out onto our rear neighbor's backyard. All the homes in our neighborhood had a 2-tier roof system, with a smaller roof leading right up to where one of the bedrooms were. And across the way, someone was quite clearly standing on the smaller roof of our neighbor's place, sticking out like a sore thumb against the backdrop of snow on the roof. They were very carefully making their way upwards towards one of the bedroom windows, a bedroom that I knew our neighbor's two little girls slept in. They moved in sometime after us, and I'd watched them re-wallpaper from beige to lilac before putting up a bunch of boy band posters. I hadn't ever actually talked to the family, I just put two and two together, so when it looked like the guy was slowly plopping his way up the gently sloping roof to their bedroom, I knew I had to do something. I ran back into my bedroom, told my wife to call the cops, then grabbed the Ruger 22 that I used to hunt rabbits with from time to time out of the closet. As I took it out of its case and loaded her up, I told my wife exactly what was happening, along with where she needed to send the cops. After that, I threw on my boots and ran out into the backyard wearing nothing but a bathrobe and boots to confront the guy on the neighbor's roof. First thing I did was call out to him, loud and aggressive, asking him what he thought he was doing. The guy froze as soon as I called out, turned a little to face me, then just turned back again to keep on going up the roof. I called out again. I told him the cops were on their way, and that there was going to be trouble if he didn't get to explaining himself real quick. He didn't even turn back that time. He just kept on plopping up the roof towards the little girl's window. I figured a warning shot in the air might deter him, just to let him know that I was serious, and to wake the neighbors to let them know something was happening. If I got cited for it later, so be it, but at the time, I didn't have the luxury of being able to fret about bylaws and HOA regulations. So I aimed my 22 into the air and let off 2 rounds to try and keep his attention. He was crouching by the girl's bedroom window by this point, and after I fired off the 2 shots, he stopped and looked down at me for a few seconds with this wild, wide-eyed look on his face. That was the only thing that really slowed him, but although I told him the next 2 would be aimed at him, he just carried on what he was doing and suddenly started wailing on the girl's window, trying to break the glass so he could unlock it. The moment he slammed his fist into the glass, you could hear the 2 girls inside beginning to scream, and I kept waiting for one of the girls' parents to run into the bedroom to put a gun on the guy too. But he kept punching the glass, this thick, double glazing too, so it wasn't budging easily, and the girls kept screaming and screaming. I didn't want to have to shoot the guy. I kept waiting for the situation to just resolve itself somehow, but then the moment the girls' window smashed, I heard their cries even louder, and I knew I had no choice. I didn't want to shoot the guy. In my mind, the guy was just going to surrender and stop what he was doing the moment that he saw me pointing a gun at him. And that's how it always happens in movies, right? The good guy says freeze, the bad guy puts his hands up, and then the cops show up, take him to jail, then the good guy rides off into the sunset. Only this guy didn't seem to care that he had a gun drawn on him. All he seemed to care about was smashing his way into those little girls' bedroom so he could do God knows what with them. He seemed like he knew he was going to get caught. He probably knew that he was going to get shot breaking into houses in a state with gun laws like ours. He just didn't seem to care. All that was important to him was getting to those girls, and that's what was really terrifying me about this whole thing, even all these years later. He was going to make me carry his water, as my grandpa used to say. He was going to put the burden of taking a life on me, and for that, I'll always hate the guy. But thankfully, it didn't have to come to that. I was too focused on aiming down the sights to notice someone entering the girl's bedroom, but I sure as heck noticed the 2 shots that rang out as the homeowner put 2 bullets into the guy trying to get into his little girl's room. The guy had stayed quiet the whole time, not a single peep as I called out or threatened to shoot him, but our neighbor's bullets hit him. He started squealing like a stuck pig, and I mean squealing. The noises he made that night made it sound like he wasn't even human, which in my estimation, he wasn't, or at least there's something lacking in him that made him less human than most. The bullet must have only caused a superficial wound because he just kept rolling back and forth on the roof and screaming until the cops finally showed up. The officers were able to climb up to put the guy in cuffs and render a little first aid for his gunshot wound, but they had to get the fire department out with a winch to get the guy off the roof without hurting him any more than he already was. The emergency vehicles were there till dawn, and my son didn't sleep a wink until all the big trucks were gone from the neighborhood. And if you think he asked a whole bunch of questions about Santa, You should have seen how many questions he asked about that whole incident. He still enjoyed Christmas that year, as all of his presents were a great way of taking his mind off of what had just happened. He still didn't 100% understand what happened, he just knew that it was bad. My wife had managed to protect him from seeing the shooting, but he still heard the screams. To be honest, I think just about the whole neighborhood did. The guy must have been in quite a bit of pain to make the sounds that he did, but I can't say he didn't deserve it. A few years ago, I went to visit an old friend for Christmas. Happenstance had it that we were both alone around the holidays, so instead of spending it alone like a couple of old spinsters, we decided to have a very drunk Christmas, just the two of us. So after a Christmas dinner of fried chicken and waffles and a lot of wine, we both hit the hay with plans to nurse our hangovers all day the next day. Being the good friend that she was, she let me take her big double bed while she took the smaller, lumpier single one in her spare bedroom. Then, in the middle of the night, I found myself waking up with a distinct feeling that there was someone in the room with me. I don't know if I'd heard the door creak or a footstep on the carpet, but I rolled over in bed, then sat up to look at the door. I was expecting to see my friend, and although I only caught a glimpse of the face in the doorway thanks to how dark it was, I saw enough to know that it definitely wasn't my friend. Out of pure instinct, I cried out something like, "Who are you?" I was startled but not frightened, and I assumed that it was all just some kind of innocent mistake that some male stranger was just lurking there in the dark hallway. But that was all just wishful thinking, I guess. And as the man burst into the room and attempted to restrain me, I began to scream. But then suddenly, as the man was pulling me out of bed and forcing me to the ground, he seemed to experience this sudden realization. He'd obviously assumed that since I was sleeping in my friend's bed, that I was her. And when the penny dropped, he started demanding to know where she was. I was in no fit to answer him, though. All I did was scream and cry and beg him not to hurt me. And the next thing I remember was the room's light flicking on. I opened my eyes to see my friend standing in the doorway, gun in her hand, and she's pointing it at the stranger while screaming, "Get off of her, Todd! Get off of her now!" 1,000 different thoughts go rushing through my head, and I guess it was just more wishful thinking, but I figured if my friend actually knew this guy, then things would be okay. I know how dumb that sounds in retrospect, but I was exhausted, still kind of drunk and more terrified than I'd ever been in my whole life. All I wanted was for this living nightmare to end, but the reality was, we had quite a way to go first. The creep, whose name was apparently Todd, started telling my friend that she didn't have the guts to shoot him, but she just kept saying, "Try me." Todd then told my friend that if she didn't put the gun down, he'd hurt me, which caused my friend to start screaming, "Don't you dare!" And the whole time I was just frozen with fear. I'd never experienced anything so terrifying in my life. I couldn't see any way out of the situation that didn't get me hurt or killed in some way, either by Todd's hand or my friend's straight bullets. I begged them both to resolve the situation, more blubbers and begs than anything coherent, at least up until Todd clamped a hand over my mouth and repeated his accusation. It was obvious that the pair had some kind of history, and that's what gave me the most hope that things would end peacefully. But then, almost out of nowhere, Todd let go of me, jumped up to his feet, and rushed my friend. I heard 2 deafening shots, and at first, I thought my friend had totally missed because Todd just fell into her and took her down in the hallway. It was only when she easily struggled out from under him and he started to groan that I realized she'd actually hit him. My ears were still ringing, and I was still frozen with fear at that point. It was all just too much for me. But when my friend barked at me to get up and follow her, I did just that, adrenaline and all. I had stepped over Todd's body to do so, and I thought that he was going to reach up and grab my ankle like it was some dumb horror movie or something, but that didn't happen. He just laid there groaning, begging us to call 911. My friend did so, but her priority was telling the cops that she was about to kill a man if he got up and started attacking her again. The EMTs showing up in a timely fashion was just pure luck on Todd's part, and he ended up surviving his injuries, and my friend avoided both criminal and civil cases in the year or so that followed, but the story of how he came to be there, bleeding on her bedroom floor, is a long and convoluted one, and I'll try to keep it as condensed as possible, but here goes. My friend was a divorcee, and around 18 months before that Christmas night, she'd met this charming bachelor named Todd. Obviously, she didn't realize what a monster he was at the time, but as the months went on, their relationship got worse and worse. My friend says it was like a frog in a pot of boiling water. Dropping it at boiling point, the frog tries to jump right back out, but lower the frog in when the water is tepid, then heat it up real slow so it barely notices, and by the time it's at boiling point, it's too late to do anything about it. The whole reason she was alone that Christmas was because she'd split up with Todd and was trying to move on. But Todd wasn't willing to, and the prospect of spending Christmas without the woman he'd once controlled was obviously too much for him. And that's how he ended up breaking in during the middle of the night, and by some miracle, it was me in her bed instead of her. Sure, what happened sucked really, really hard, and I wish it never had to happen, but like I said, it was kind of a Christmas miracle that I'd been there that night. If Todd had the chance to get the drop on her like that, if she hadn't been able to get to her gun, God knows what kind of awful things would have happened that night. I guess that makes me sound like bait in a way, as that's basically what I was that night, but she had no way of knowing he'd actually try and hurt her like that. He was a psycho, and an aggressive one at that, but I guess sometimes you don't know if someone has the capacity to kill or not until it's far too late to do anything about it. Both of our situations have improved dramatically, but we still talk about it every day. And at some point in the future, we plan to hold a joint Christmas together with all of our families in tow. Things are looking much brighter, but we'll never forget the night when, by some miracle of happenstance, we ended up saving each other's lives. I was working day shift on a drilling rig in the middle of nowhere, and I had volunteered to stay on over the holidays in exchange for the extra pay. At one point, the rig manager comes to me and tells me that I have to switch to nights to supervise the new guy and make sure all the assigned tasks are completed. Apparently, he failed to complete almost all of his important duties the night before, so now I'm stuck on nights until he improved. I work with this kid, and he seems good, a guy with a solid work ethic. I can't understand why he failed the previous night. We completed all the work inside, and now it was time to go get a few things done outside. I tell him that we should get after changing that oil on the loader, and he tells me that he can't work outside in the dark. I kind of laugh and say that we are definitely going to do that oil change, and he says he's scared. I look at him, and there's real fear in his eyes. I ask him why, and he tells me. Now keep in mind the rig is in the middle of nowhere, hours to the closest small town out of the bush, and his story went like this. He had done everything asked of him inside and went and started working out of the buildings on the lease outside. He got hungry, so he grabbed his lunch. He left an apple on the hood of the truck and walked away for a few minutes. When he came back, the apple was still in the hood of the truck, but there was now a bite out of it. He looked on the ground, and there were human shoe prints leading out of the trees to the truck and back into the trees. We're in the middle of nowhere, and there is no way someone should be out there in the bush in that temperature at that time of night. So I start thinking, that means somebody was watching him from the darkness of the trees and took the time to mess with him. This person is either the funniest guy alive or a super strange bushman. Looking at where we were, the chances of him being the funniest guy ever were very slim. So now we have a strange man in the bush watching us. As a 6'4", 260-pound rig hand, I'm weirded right out by this story. It sent a shiver right up my spine when I realized how that must have gone down. We went, and the footsteps were still there. We changed the oil, but we both had pipe wrenches as weapons in case we had a visitor, and it still creeps me out to this day. I've been watching and listening to the stories you put out for just over a year, and I want you to know how much they've helped me. Hearing firsthand accounts from people who've suffered through tragic or terrifying life events is something I find deeply cathartic. Not because I enjoy hearing their pain, but because there's light at the end of the tunnel. Revisiting a terrifying event by writing it down seemed impossible to me at one point, like it was the bravest thing in the world, and I knew that a big part of therapizing myself would be to work up to doing just that, so now that I'm able, I feel duty-bound to continue the tradition and share my story with others. I'm hoping that writing this up will be like shoving my trauma into a burlap sack, and sending it to you will be like tossing it off a metaphorical cliff. But at the bare minimum, this story can at least serve as a lesson for others. Last year, the upper management of the office that I worked at decided to throw a little Christmas party. I've worked in the office environment for most of my life, and office parties tended to be tepid at best and tiresome at worst. But this one seemed way, way different. Like tons of sectors, COVID had a big effect on the way we worked, and although there was a huge novelty to working spreadsheets in a onesie while tossing treats at my cat, the lack of social interaction really got to me after a while. I'm a people person, and I actually liked a lot of the folks that I worked with, so when COVID dragged on into the winter of 2020 and it became obvious that there'd be no Christmas party that year, I was actually kind of upset. So last year when the subject of a Christmas party came up, the whole office got super excited. Stuff like that was the good part of getting back to normal, and if we had to suffer the bad parts like commuting and weekly meetings, we were damn sure going to make use of the perks, too. In the run-up to the night of the party, we organized a Secret Santa list, ran a Best Christmas Sweater competition, all stuff that we found corny in years gone by that we approached with a fresh vigor. But that vigor applied to the party itself, which was planned to be held in the office on the evening of Thursday the 23rd, which was the last working day before the extended holiday weekend. We agreed that we'd all pull a few bucks to buy beers and wine coolers, but there'd be no hard liquor present at the party. This is a standard operating procedure for pretty much all office parties, as beer brings the cheer, but whiskey makes them frisky, so generally speaking, everyone managed to behave themselves. But not last year. I don't know if it was all the stress and social isolation coming to the forefront, but it quickly became obvious that many of us would be bringing a little extra with us. For most of us, that little extra would come in a hip flask, but for others, it came in a considerably smaller package. So on the night of the party, folks are getting nicely warmed up, letting loose, and talking a little more freely. Then, once the atmosphere was suitably festive, my closest office buddy gave me a little wink and ushered me away to one of the storage closets. Inside were a handful of the younger folks I worked with, all in the progress of loading up their drinks with a mix of hip flasks and miniature liquor bottles. The goal obviously being to get as drunk as possible, as quickly as possible. I too had a few mini-bar-sized bottles, and right as I'm trying to unscrew the cap with my teeth, not the most ladylike thing I've ever done, I see a guy pull out a little baggie of white powder. Now I don't mess with hard drugs like that, but I'm also not a particularly judgmental person, but while I wasn't exactly about to snitch on them, I didn't really feel like hanging out while people took what turned out to be coke. So then, right as they start fixing to take it, I take my cue to leave after they told me that they'd only be a few minutes. I remember just kind of forgetting about them for a while. I swanned off with my vodka-laced wine cooler, drinking and dancing and laughing my butt off with folks that I've never normally socialized with. It felt great. Things were back to normal again, and we could all just get on with our lives like the whole lockdown and almost getting laid off thing hadn't happened at all. And then, right as I'm getting seriously tipsy, Mariah Carey hit the airwaves. As many of you will know, the song All I Want for Christmas Is You has the power to turn even the most buttoned down of Christmas gatherings into a full-blown festive commotion. It unleashes the inner diva of every housewife who's even had a whiff of alcohol, because it's just not Christmas without Mariah. Myself and my office BFF had discussed the song's magical properties on multiple occasions prior to the party, so the second it came on, I started rubbernecking to see where she was. She'd been one of the folks doing drugs in the storage closet, the same folks who told me that they'd be out in a minute. But way more than just a minute had passed, and not a single one of them was anywhere to be seen. All I Want for Christmas Is You was still in that slow introductory phase, so the second it hit, I knew I had exactly 57 seconds to find my office BFF so we could be singing and dancing along with it right as the first verse kicked in. I'm frantically looking around, assuming that she was out of the storage closet, but when I couldn't see any of them, I decided that I better go check the closet. I remember rushing over to the closet, trying not to fall over my kitten heels, ready to drag her out whether she was done loading up or not so we could get to dancing. But then, right as I'm only a few feet away from the closet door, it opens up, and one of the younger guys basically falls out of the open door and collapses on the ground in front of me. My first thought was actually something like, "Geez, what were you pre-gaming with, moonshine?" But then the guy looks up at me, with this terrified look in his eyes, and slurs the words, I can't feel my legs." I immediately go into crisis mode, rushing to turn off the music so I can hear the 911 operator, with people slowly realizing that one of the younger team members, who shall remain anonymous for reasons that will become obvious, was suffering from some kind of medical emergency. There were a few ripples of panic at first, but in spite of being a little worse for wear, our office manager quickly got to keeping everyone calm while a few others started administering first aid. I just kept myself focused on giving the right information, and when the dispatcher asked me to go over to my coworker to relay some basic information to her, I rushed back over just in time to see someone opening up the storage closet. Because of the angle that I was approaching, I didn't immediately see how the inside of the closet looked, but I did catch my coworker's reaction as they opened the door up and looked inside. In a split second, their expression went from concerned and curious to completely and utterly horrified, and I suddenly realized where my office BFF was. She was lying in the storage closet, along with the rest of the folks who'd been taking drugs, and each of them were either dead or dying. I know this might sound like a Just Say No themed after-school special at this point, but I promise you, that's not what this is. I experimented plenty in college, and I'm hardly a nun these days either. 99 times out of 100, my coworkers could have snuck off to do a little blow, then returned to enjoy their dumb office party with a little more pep in their step. I'm not condoning that either, but it is what it is. Only on that occasion, and totally unbeknownst to anyone, they didn't just do a little blow, because for some god-forsaken reason, their little bag of coke was laced with fentanyl. I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain what fentanyl is. Everyone and their mama knows that a grain of it is enough to kill a dozen people, and we later found out that there was so much in their systems that they were probably dead before they even realized what was happening, and the guy who fell out of the closet hadn't actually done any. He just touched a little before collapsing and almost ODing. He was the only guy who survived, all thanks to 2 cops who had been in the area with some Narcan in their car. And for those that don't know, Narcan is basically this miracle drug that stops heroin overdoses, and it comes in a little nasal spray. And if it wasn't for the cops being equipped and trained to use it, 4 people would have died that night, instead of just 3. As you can probably guess, the whole thing just rocked our office, and the whole town too, really. We had to shut down while the cops investigated the whole thing, and some of us went to visit the survivors in the hospital and then at home. Some people just didn't return to work at all. It was beyond heartbreaking for everyone involved. I, for one, spent a lot of time with the family of my office BFF, grieving with them, supporting them as best I could, and just trying to make sense of it all. I don't work at that office anymore, and although the office I now work at is throwing a Christmas party, I know I won't be attending this year. I'll make up some excuse at the last minute, tell them that I'm feeling under the weather or something, but those close to me will know why Christmas won't really be Christmas for me this year. It's not because there'll be no Mariah Carey. It'll be because there'll be no office best friend forever. May she, and the others who died that night, forever rest in peace. Back in the day, I was on a call for the burn unit on Christmas Day. Life Flight brought in a guy who tried to deep fry a frozen turkey, with the only safety precaution being that he did it on his back porch. All he managed to do was turn himself and his whole setup into one big fireball, and the only parts of his body that weren't burned were his butt cheeks, which were pressed against the ground after falling back during it. So, 98% TBSA full thickness burn. The guy looked completely charred and hair burn off and everything, and there were patches where his clothes had completely melted into his skin. It sounds crazy. I'd never actually seen a burn that bad at the time, and it actually looked kind of fake when I first saw the guy. He looked like an extra in a disaster movie or something, and the only thing that made it real for me was the smell. He literally smelled like a mix of burned bacon and plastic, and the fact that he wasn't moving or making any noise just made him seem like even more of a prop. That all changed when he woke up screaming, but he still didn't sound human. I helped treat him for my whole shift, and the only word I heard him say was pain, 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 until we pumped him full of drugs to knock him out again. And at the risk of sounding dramatic, I've seen some horrific things in my time, but the sight, sound, and smell of that guy still haunt me way more than anything else. The misery, the agony, the horror of what he went through, all over something so completely moronic. We did everything we could to keep him alive, but it was clear from the get-go that his chances were in the single-digit percentage range. He passed just before dawn on December 26th. Amazing he lasted that long, really. It was mostly just heavy pain management towards the end, then his organs finally gave out, and that was that. I really felt for his family, losing someone so horribly at what's supposed to be such a happy time of the year. I know if it was my father or husband or brother, Christmas just wouldn't be the same for a long time after, and I hope they've managed to find peace all this time later. At the end of last November, me and my mom went to watch the Christmas lights ceremony in the town center of where we live. It's something we'd done every year since I was little, and although it's more mulled wine than hot cocoa these days, it's an event we still take a great amount of joy in. But not last year. Last year something happened that will taint the lights ceremony for a long time to come. And although with time I'm sure things will get back to normal, those that were there that night will always remember. The annual ceremonial switching on the town center's Christmas lights is quite a big deal, and it isn't confined to just the event itself. And there's a Christmas market with all kinds of food stalls and a Santa's grotto for the kids. It's a great time, and there's usually a celebrity guest brought in to do the job of pushing the big red button which turns the lights on. If we're a fan of whoever's brought in, me and my mom always camp out at the front so we can take pictures and stuff, but last year, it was just one of the people from Love Island, so we were content to take advantage of the lack of queue at the mulled wine kiosk before watching from the back of the crowd. Now, the light ceremony always takes place in one of the two big town squares, so it's a big open space surrounded by larger streets and smaller streets. Me and my mom happened to be right near one of these poorly lit smaller streets where a group of kids were hanging around and generally causing mischief. They looked to be about 12 to 14 and seemed divided into two distinct groups, one all boys and one all girls. There was a lot of teasing and name-calling going back and forth, and once or twice, someone in the crowd would turn around to shush them. This kept on going for a while, with the noise escalating and diminishing, and it honestly seemed like nothing but innocent fun. But then, after a particularly vicious-sounding exchange, I felt like it was my turn to turn around to tell them to behave themselves. One of the girls was shining the light of her mobile phone right in his face, and she was saying, "You're on live, you're on live." So I'm assuming it was something to do with social media, too. The boy was strongly objecting, saying, "Stop filming me, stop," over and over again, and then suddenly, he lashed out with a closed fist, knocking the girl backwards before he and his friends ran away. I wasn't the only one who saw it, so I didn't have to alert anyone as cries of, "Oi, come back here," and "That boy just hit that little girl" started ringing out from the crowd. I rushed forward to see if the little girl was okay because she kept leaning up but then falling back, so I assumed that she'd fallen funny and was just injured in some way. I couldn't see her face because of the furry hood that she had over her head, but when I did, I realized the boy hadn't just punched her. There was blood all over her neck and chin, both from a wound to her neck and from where she was coughing up blood. She wasn't leaning up because she was trying to get up. She was wrenching upwards because she was trying to clear her airway of blood. All I could do was try and stem the bleeding, clasping my gloved hands over the side of her neck while someone else called the ambulance. But it was no good. She passed out before the paramedics arrived, and they were using shock paddles on the poor thing as they got her into the ambulance. It was so bad that almost no one had any hope that she would survive, and it came as no surprise when the bad news broke that she'd been declared dead on arrival at the hospital. The aftermath was just absolutely heartbreaking, and although the police went hard in trying to catch the killer, knowing that they were kicking in doors to try and find a 12 or 13-year-old was terribly horrifying. And to think that someone that young was capable of something so hideously violent, and that they were actually hiding out like a bloody fugitive, it was just a nightmare. Anyone with a male child of that age who started acting funny thought that they might have been the ones harboring a wanted murderer. People got terribly paranoid, and as I said, it was a terrible, terrible time for all involved. We later heard that a young man was arrested, then the story faded to the background for a while until he was sentenced during the summer. The 13-year-old boy got a minimum of 13 years in prison for murder, meaning he'd spend as many years in prison as he'd been alive by that time. The grim poetry of that really got to people, at least I know it got to me. It was morbidly poetic, and as much as people appreciated the long sentence for the justice it served, it was all just so tragic because none of it ever needed to happen in the first place. This year, out of respect for that poor girl and her family, the city council had decided to hold the light ceremony in the second of our town's 2 squares. I don't know how Mum is feeling about it, but I think I might skip this year's event, because I know I won't be able to keep my mind off the tragic events of the previous year and the look in that little girl's eyes when she realized that she was going to die. Okay, so I work at a maximum security psychiatric hospital. As you can probably imagine, these kinds of experiences come with the territory. To set the scene for you, the hospital I work at was built in the 50s as an asylum. The concrete walls are cold and sounds echo throughout it with relative ease. The pressure differentials between units in the main hall create a haunting howling sound as the air escapes through the cracks under the doors. We typically keep the lights out to encourage patients to sleep through the night. And then there's me, walking the halls alone to check that everyone is still breathing. I've heard people laughing to themselves, whispering conversations to someone unseen by me. I've even ran to emergencies where other patients have snuck into another's room to beat them violently, having to pull a 300-plus pound man off another man he attacked in his sleep, all the while he was still stomping on his head. But the scariest things were when I was doing a round on Christmas Eve, and I came across one of our blind patients. You know how in movies you see people with hallucinations that cut their eyes out looking for relief? No, I didn't find a pair of peepers freshly gouged out, if that's what you were thinking. However, this patient had in fact done exactly this a number of years ago, and as a result was completely blind. The worst part is, it didn't make the hallucinations go away. Now all he can see are the haunting visions that brought him into this place in the first place. So, this patient had been with us for some time, and every night I walk by his room, he's in the same position, standing facing the wall with his back to the door. No matter how long I stand there, he doesn't move. This is nothing new though, as I've seen a number of patients with catatonia before. They just stand or sit there with a blank or sometimes fearful expression and react to nothing. So the scary part for me was when I passed by his room, walking quietly so as to not to wake any patients, and I peek into his room through the window. He's standing facing the wall. Just before I'm about to continue on with my rounds, I see his head turn, like he heard a voice. He turns around with his empty eye sockets and looks at me. "Allie, is that you?" I nearly soiled myself. I didn't even know this patient knew my name, let alone that he could tell somehow that it was me standing there. I probably should have reassured him that I was real, but in that moment, I was just too scared, so I kept walking. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Christmas Eve of 1998, me and my older brother were driving back from Washington Island to our hometown of Madison, Wisconsin. We were both working on a lavender farm up there at the time. Not the most well-paying or exciting of jobs, but work is work when you have as few options as we did. It was a 5-hour drive on a good day, but around the holidays, with bad weather and worse traffic, you could expect to be trapped in your car for upwards of 8 hours. In light of that, me and my brother always came to an agreement before we departed. One of us would drive, while the other would get so wasted in the back seat that they could sleep almost the whole way. Last time had been my turn to cozy up with a 12-pack of Blue Ribbon, so that time, it was my turn to drive. We had a pretty good system laid out. You could always assuage the irritation of the long drive by looking forward to the time when you could be the one in the back seat, blackout drunk while butchering Bing Crosby lyrics and all that sort of thing. However, the one was a huge flaw. P-stops. They'd start out sparingly, but at its peak, my brother would be demanding that I pull over almost every 30 minutes or so. We became intimately familiar with almost every gas station and truck stop along the whole of the 57, and it was during one of these routine P-stops that our story really begins. So we pull into a fairly small truck stop, head inside to use the bathroom and grab some road food, then we head back out towards the car. It was late afternoon, pretty damp out, just miserable Wisconsin winter weather, and then out of nowhere, some guy on a superbike just tears right past us, deafeningly close, which has my drunk brother whooping and hollering like he's watching the Indy 500 or something. He thought it was the best thing that he'd seen all day, and in all fairness, it was pretty awesome. Sure, the guy had been going 100 miles an hour, but it was the holidays, on a fairly quiet stretch of highway. Not the kind of thing you'd catch me doing, but different strokes, I guess. Anyways, we get back on the road, and I swear to God, we hadn't even gone 5 minutes when I spotted something lying at the side of the road. It was just blocking the road enough that I would have had to slow down anyways, and as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. It was the bike that we'd just seen zooming past us 5 minutes previous, and just on the other side of it was this long stain on the road. It started off all dark, but the further it got, the redder it got, and right at the end of it was what used to be the biker. What remained of the guy didn't even have a shape anymore. He was all bloodied and broken and torn up, just this lump of something that used to be a person. Seeing that was the single most heart-stoppingly horrifying moment of my whole life, and I can barely even explain what it did to me. It was like knowing people could end up looking like that made the world a little uglier, and the fact life could end so suddenly made it more frightening too. My brother, the idiot that he is, kept insisting that the biker might still be alive, and no matter how much I tried to stop him, he ended up shoving his way past me. He lumbered along the red streak up to where the body was, took one look at the guy, then ran over to the side of the road to puke up 8 or 9 cans worth of what he was drinking. By the time he'd gotten himself together, I had already switched on my blinkers, and thankfully, another car showed up pretty quickly. We stayed up while the other driver drove to the truck stop that we'd been at to call the cops, and I think it was maybe only 45 minutes from the time we first saw the bike to when the first cop car showed up on scene. It definitely slowed us down some, but I couldn't just leave the guy there for someone else to find. One of my first thoughts after finding him had been wondering if he'd been rushing back to family rather than just taking his bike out for a spin. No doubt he had family, or at least friends or something, and for them to get news like that so close to the holidays, I can't even imagine what they must have went through. The remainder of the drive was considerably less jolly, and I worked hard to catch up with my brother's level of intoxication once we arrived at our parents' place. It definitely made me appreciate the gift of family a lot more that year, My dad brought it up while saying grace that it hit so hard I got a lump in my throat. To this day, I don't know what exactly happened to make that guy crash, but I do know that drive safe became something I tell people when parting ways. I figure it just helps to remind people sometimes so they don't end up lying on the side of the road, barely looking human anymore. Many years ago, when my now 28-year-old daughter was still an infant, myself, her, and our dog were at the apartment that we were living in at the time. It was Christmas Eve. My wife was at work at a nursing job, and she wasn't due home until the early hours of the morning. I was sitting on the couch watching TV. My daughter was asleep on a blanket on the floor, and the dog, a husky Akita hybrid, was about 10 feet away, laying in the doorway between our kitchen and the living room area. I was watching whatever it was that I was watching when, all of a sudden, Thor, our dog, starts with this low-level, guttural growling. I figured that he had heard someone in another apartment or walking by through the parking lot and didn't think much of it. He was very defensive like that, so it wasn't like it was too out of the ordinary. After a few seconds pass, I notice that it's getting louder, and I can see out of the corner of my eye that he's lifted his head up off of his paws. His ears are perked, and he's looking at the ceiling over where my daughter was laying. I look up, don't see anything all, and tell him to knock it off. But right after I tell him to stop, he jumps up, starts circling my sleeping daughter, literally walking around her blanket that she's laying on, and growling more and more intensely, even stopping once and outright snarling and snapping his teeth, all the while staring up at the ceiling. After about 2 or 3 minutes, and me having no clue what to do since I can't see anything, I did not want to reach for my daughter with him circling her like that, and he laid down next to my daughter, rested his head on her back, and stayed there for almost an hour, still intently staring up at the ceiling and occasionally growling. I make sure it was just some kind of false alarm. I went upstairs to knock on the door of the apartment above us. No one answered the door, and I didn't hear so much as a peep from inside. As far as I could tell, the place was empty, but as we know by this point, Thor seemed to think otherwise. To this day, I have no idea what was going on or what he saw or sensed, but it was extremely creepy to me. Thor had never acted like that before, and he's never acted like that since. Part of me wants to know what was going on, if it was just a rat in the floorboards or something, and I just creep myself out for no reason. But then again, if there's any other less tangible explanation, I'd rather not know at all. Many years ago now, I was riding along with my dad, who was a trucker. It was Christmas break, and sometime while driving through the night, he shouts, "Oh no," over and over again. I was laying in the truck cabin bed playing on my PlayStation on the little TV, so I was really confused, hoping we didn't hit anything. My heart sank when he told me to put my shoes on and that we gotta help. And then he told me to call 911. Next thing, my dad pulls over and I see it behind our tractor trailer. A speeding car was going too fast and had rolled multiple times down a steep embankment. We went to see if we could do anything while we waited for EMS to arrive, and it was one of the worst things I'd ever seen in my life. It turned out to be a family of 4, but you couldn't immediately tell how old they were or what they looked like. They were all just crumpled, bloody messes, slumped upside down in all kinds of unnatural-looking positions. Once ambulances came, we left. They arrived pretty quickly, and though I can't say for certain, I was pretty sure the whole family had passed. Kinda messed me up a bit. I'd never seen a body in that state or a dead body outside of a funeral. Even to this day, 20+ years later, I still think about what I had seen, even after going into the medical field and witnessing worse. They could have been headed to visit family, looking forward to some wholesome reunion or something. And instead, they ended up all messed up at the side of the road, here one second, and gone the next. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, or maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All the links down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, plop, lock, and drop it.